Hello, my AMST 140 students. This is Professor Donald Collins again. It is week 14, and this is the final video recording of a lecture, if you want to say, or a lecture summary that I'm doing for the course. So, yay! Yay, everybody! We've made it to week 14. So, I don't want to belabor this too much. I just want to go over a few things regarding your reflections, regarding your group projects and the materials around that, or individual projects or individual papers as the case may be, and then go on to talk about the main theme for this week, which is around DC protest culture, centered around Women's March of 2017 and where things have been since the 1960s. What does all this mean for DC, for us as a country as well? And then, ride off into the sunset, so to speak. So, a couple of things. First, on the reflections, I've looked at 15 of these, 15, 16 of these. I've given feedback on at least 15 over the past week, so thank you all for getting those in. Some of you, despite my messages and changes and Google Calendar and everything else, still thought that the fourth reflection was due on March 25th. I think that was 2 or 3 of you out of 19, so it's not great, but in terms of not being 100%, but it's good enough. All of them were thoughtful. All of them went in directions that were good. Most of them seemed very personable and honest, so I don't really have anything to complain about there. Remember, I'm not grading these. I'm not literally applying an individual grade to each of your assignments, because everyone in the class knows if you participate and do your work, you'll get either an A or an A minus in the course. Going into the spring break, the middle of the term, 16 of 19 students in the course had an A minus average or higher anyway. So between all of that, the only difference between an A and an A minus really is if someone just knocks it out the box, either with an assignment or just overall quality of work, right? And some of those things, that's somewhat subjective, but that's the difference between A and A minus anyway. Because people are all generally doing very good work, but someone really knocks it out the box, in terms of talent or effort or just simple analytical brain power, that kind of thing. So it shouldn't really, there are really no worries here in terms of your grade, and you shouldn't be worried about your grade at this point. And if you are, you probably should just email me and we can Skype about it or what have you. So that's one. I've given you all feedback on your group project executive summaries or individual project executive summaries or individual papers that people have decided to do as an alternative to doing a group project executive summary and a presentation. So there was a little bit of confusion from a couple of you about what was due and what was supposed to be due. If you're doing a group project, you definitely have to do an executive summary, and you definitely have to do a presentation. If you decide to do an individual project in that same manner, you don't have to do as much in terms of trying to fill everything out. You can try to do as much as possible, right? But you still end up writing an executive summary and you end up doing a presentation. If you are doing a paper, you are writing a paper, you're writing your paper in various drafts, first draft, second draft. You do not have to do an executive summary. You do have to do a presentation, but it doesn't have to be as flowing and all-encompassing as the presentations for the group and individual projects. You just simply have to summarize what you wrote about in your paper. It can be literally just you sitting in front of a computer like I am doing right now, and just for 5 or 6 minutes, my paper, I covered these things in my paper. This is what I discovered. This is what I argued, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be more elaborate than that. If you decide that you want to do a PowerPoint, do a PowerPoint. But if you just want to video record yourself for 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes talking about your paper, that's fine. If we were doing this for the course, what would happen is group project folks would be presenting for probably 10 to 15 minutes. And then they would take Q&A. People doing individual group projects would have 10 minutes to present and then do Q&A. And then people doing their individual paper can do 5 to 8 minutes. And then take a couple of questions. So that's how I had set it up in my head. To do that for next week, which would have been the 22nd, and then the following week, the 29th of April. But we do not have to do it that way. I mean, so as a general rule, for those who are doing individual presentations or summaries of their papers, the most you should go is probably 10 minutes. If you can keep it in that 8 to 10 minute range, that would be great. For those of you who are doing group presentations, 10 to 15 minutes, ideally probably 12, around 12 minutes. Be succinct. If you want to use PowerPoint, use PowerPoint. In addition to doing video, you can embed video and audio in your PowerPoint. You can make it separate. It is entirely up to you how you do that, just as long as I can grab it and put it, and it doesn't take up 10 gigabytes of information, and I can put it on my Google Drive so that everyone has access to it. That works for me. If you want to do it through YouTube, that even works even better, because there's really no space limit on YouTube for me as far as that's concerned. So either or, we'll try to work around these technologies around that. But bottom line is, your second drafts or your executive summaries or your papers are due this Friday by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. It's a soft deadline in the sense that if you really need more time, let me know and I will give you more time. Your presentation materials with that video, audio, podcast, PowerPoint, all that's going into whatever you're presenting for everyone in the class are also due at that time. But that's as much as you have done on Friday. You can add to it, revise it, do whatever you think would work to make it better until Wednesday the 22nd. By Wednesday afternoon the 22nd, I want to be putting all of that material up so that people have a chance to watch it. And so if the people have a chance to watch it, then they can give you feedback directly or indirectly when we come back together to meet again. I do not anticipate doing a Wednesday Skype next Wednesday on the 22nd of April, because I want to give people as much time as possible to finish up their presentations and give people more time to actually watch them, which means we will not meet in terms of video presentations or in terms of talking about those presentations until the 29th of April. So essentially all of you will have next week off from seeing me on Skype. I'm not lecturing. You can contact me if you want to do virtual office hours. If you want to do virtual office hours that are not my normal office hours, from 12:30 to 1:30 on Wednesdays. All during the week of April the 20th. So just keep that in mind. So that's how I'm setting things up. I mean, it's almost like we would be doing it the way we would be doing class on the 22nd. If we met on the 22nd, I wouldn't lecture. And you would just be there, students, to hear each other's presentations and ask questions and make comments, and that literally would be it. We're doing the same thing, except through digitally, but offline and not live in a synchronous sort of way. It will be asynchronous, and I'll set it up so that everyone has access. So we'll figure it out. We'll make it work. So please email me if you feel free to email me if you have any questions about this. The Google Calendar links I sent to everybody about 3 weeks ago covers most of these soft deadlines, and so do the announcements in detail. So keep that in mind too. All right. So this week, Women's March of 2017 and the limits of protest. In a nutshell, what this is about is sort of summing up DC and the various parts of DC, various cultures that are within DC, with sort of a modern event centered on the Women's March of 2017 and protest of the election of our current president the day after his inauguration on Saturday, January 21st, 2017, where somewhere in the neighborhood of 600,000 or more women came together to protest someone they see as a misogynist, someone they see as sexist, someone they see as anti-women in terms of reproductive rights, in terms of equal work for equal pay, in terms of sexual harassment and rape and anything else that involves the rights of women to equal status as men in the United States and, quite frankly, globally. I'm not really concerned about your politics around whether or not you support the current president one way or the other. I honestly don't care. I don't. And for that matter, if you don't support it, it's kind of a moot point as far as this course is concerned. There are other courses where I could definitely, share what I think one way or the other, but I'm trying to be not objective, but is sort of not talking about where I am around this as much as possible. It's still an event. That was what the event was about. That's why the event happened. You can agree or disagree with it all you want. But it points to a larger issue with how DC is centered in all of this, right? Many of the women that were in this march, most of them, disproportionately were white women, and disproportionately were middle and upper class white women. There was a minority of women of color in the march: black women, Latinx women, indigenous women, Asian women, and so on. Certainly poor women. And so part of the problem around this march is that it had all of these different constituencies, but it primarily represented the views of white feminists, of middle-class white feminists. And so that's what made the march problematic for so many. There's, this, what crystallizes for so many around this march is how they were marching for these general issues, complaining about the current, what happened in 2016, and then black women is holding up 53% of white women voted for Trump as one of their signs, which sort of crystallizes the different sorts of thinking and constituencies within this march and how they didn't really meld and gel together. That's only one aspect. It points to a larger issue around marching and protesting in DC in general. And that issue is that the effectiveness, the level of effectiveness, I talk about this in the lecture notes. How effective are these protests, are these sit-ins, these die-ins, these marches, really, when the government ultimately does what it does in terms of going to war, as in the case of the war in Iraq in 2003, even though millions of people marched against it over several weeks, not just in DC but around the country, or the first Gulf War in 1990 and 91, where again millions of people came out and marched against that war in DC and other places, and the government didn't respond. That's just sort of one package. Another package is the fact that all marches aren't about social justice anymore, at least what progressives, what people that are not just liberals, but full-force leftists, like neo-Marxists, Marxists, socialists, anarchist-type leftists, would have supported 50 years ago during the anti-war movement against Vietnam, or during the civil rights movement, or during second wave feminism in the 1950s and 60s. Marches that go on now include the March for Life, which is anti-choice, anti-abortion, and quite frankly, anti most reproductive rights that women have in the United States. That's just one example. Another example would be marches against gay rights, against LGBT rights, which many people will consider, social injustice, not social justice per se, and those sorts of things. So all of these folks constantly marching and using DC as a platform to get noticed. Are these really effective, short-term, long-term, intermediate term, in terms of getting the government to do what they want to do, or is it's just a case of look at me, I'm marching? Does it really mean anything, in other words? The other part is, while they're marching in the land of official Washington, D.C., the National Mall, the Lincoln Memorial, the U.S. Capitol, and so on, you also have the fact that there's a whole residency of people who represent these views who live in D.C. and in the DMV. But generally speaking, they're not well represented in these crowds, right? Black Washingtonians are not well represented in a lot of these crowds. White Washingtonians aren't, quite frankly, well represented in a lot of these crowds. So how much is this a reflection on particular constituencies that want what they want, squeaky wheel types wanting what they want, and how much is this a reflection, of really DC as part of the United States? In other words, things are going on in our backyard and our front lawn, and yet we're not a part of it as Washingtonians, as suburban Marylanders, as people who live in Northern Virginia, all part of the DMV, but yet, some of us are a part of this, a lot of us aren't. This is sort of just washing over us. So again, it's about effectiveness, but it's also about, to some extent, representation. Is this our city, really, when folks come out and protest against these sorts of things? Or is this really the nation's city, where the nation comes out and protests, and somehow we're just sort of sitting there? Or is it somewhere in between? Where is DC in all of this protesting and all this movement towards, right of center, center right, far right kinds of ideas, as well as center left, centrist kinds of ideas, as well as left of center, leftist kinds of ideas? It really comes down to that level of effectiveness, level of representation. And also, the final question I ask, and again, the lecture notes cover this in more detail than I can cover in one video, which is, given the state of things where things are now, especially now with this pandemic that is pushing down on us really, really hard right now across the country, what is DC's legacy as a national seat of power, as an international city, as leader of the so-called free world, right, and center of the so-called free world? Does that hold in 2020? And if it does, I guess that makes sense for us for protest movements to come down here and use DC as a platform. But if it quite doesn't, then what's DC really for, other than just getting noticed? Hey, look at me, right? Do we really expect government to do anything to help folks, to hurt folks, to move in a certain direction that meets the goals of a particular protest movement? Those are all questions that, quite frankly, I can't answer. I can give you answers, I can tell you what I think, but I can't answer based on evidence and research. I can sort of guess at best, take very good expert level educated guesses at best. But this is something that I want to talk about and through a bit more when we talk on Wednesday.